Welcome back, guys, to Wrong Turn Horror. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 scary, true Appalachian cryptid stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new horror story. The Appalachian Mountains are a place of raw beauty, rolling hills, endless trails, and forests so dense that daylight struggles to cut through. But hidden beneath that beauty are tales whispered around campfires and scrawled in old journal stales of creatures that shouldn't exist, but somehow do. Tonight, we're stepping into those dark woods together. But be warned, once you hear these stories, you might never look at the Appalachians the same way again.
It was November of 1978. The Appalachian woods were already shifting into winter. The leaves had fallen, the air bit at the skin, and silence ruled the forests of Monongahela National Forest after sundown. That night, a 46-year-old hunter named Elijah Kearns left his small cabin with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He'd lived alone for years, a widower who found comfort in the stillness of the wilderness. He knew those trails better than anyone, or at least he thought he did. He set out before dusk, hoping to track a buck he'd seen earlier in the week. But he stayed too long. The woods darkened fast in November, and Elijah soon realized he was caught in near-pitch blackness. That didn't scare him. He had a lantern and matches, and he'd walked those woods thousands of times. But as the first stars blinked awake overhead, Elijah heard something odd. It was faint, almost carried on the wind, a whistle. Slow, drawn out. Too deliberate to be random. At first, he thought it was another hunter. People sometimes whistled to announce themselves, to avoid accidents. But the tone was strange, not cheerful or casual. It was hollow, sad, almost mocking. Elijah raised his lantern higher, squinting into the trees. "Hello," he called. "That you, Jeb?" His voice carried, but nothing answered, except the whistle again, this time from behind him. Elijah turned sharply, his boots crunching leaves. No one was there. His skin prickled with unease, but he forced a laugh. Maybe it was kids playing tricks. Still, he quickened his pace, rifle tight against his chest. For every 20 steps he took, the whistle followed. Always the same, always just far enough away to feel like it was watching. He tried stopping, thinking maybe it would too. But when he froze, the whistle grew louder, closer. That's when Elijah extinguished his lantern. The forest swallowed him in blackness, only the faint stars above. He crouched low, pressing his back to a tree, hoping to catch whoever was out there. His breath came slow and shallow, misting in the cold air. And then he saw it, not with full clarity, but a shape. Tall, lean, too thin to be a man. Asterisk, its arms were long, dragging almost to its knees. And though its head was tilted unnaturally sideways, no lips moved. Yet the whistle continued, flowing steadily, piercing the silence. Elijah's instincts screamed to run, but his body locked in place. The figure swayed slightly, as if listening, as if savoring his fear, then stepped forward, deliberate, slow. Elijah snapped. He grabbed his lantern, lit it in a shaky rush, and raised his rifle. But the light seemed to do nothing. The figure's face stayed in shadow, features unreadable. All he saw were two dull, reflective eyes catching the lantern flame. The whistle shifted tone. Higher, mocking, almost like it was laughing at him. That was enough. Elijah turned and ran. The forest came alive with the crunch of his boots, branches clawing at his arms. Behind him, the whistle carried on, never strained, never broken, as though the thing could keep pace without effort. Elijah's heart pounded. He knew these trails, but in his panic he stumbled into unfamiliar ground. The trees pressed tighter, the earth sloped downward, and he realized with horror he was being herded. The whistle grew closer, louder. Suddenly, Elijah burst into a small clearing. His lantern swung wildly, casting frantic shadows on the trees. For a moment, silence fell. The whistling stopped. Elijah spun, rifle raised. "Show yourself," he barked, the though his voice cracked. From the tree-line, the figure emerged, long limbs folding unnaturally, head cocked at a sickening angle. Even in the lantern light, its skin seemed pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over bones. Elijah aimed and fired. The blast echoed through the mountains. But the figure didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. The whistle simply began again, slow and deliberate, filling the clearing with its taunt. Elijah fired again, and again. His ears rang, smoke filled his lungs. When the haze cleared, the figure was gone. By some miracle, Elijah found his way back to his cabin near midnight. He bolted the door, collapsed in a chair, and didn't move until morning light broke through. The next day, locals found him trembling, his rifle discarded in the mud outside. He refused to speak of what happened, but over the years, whispers spread through the small town of Richwood. Hunters swore they too heard the whistle. Some claimed to see the figure at the edge of campfires, never approaching, always watching. Elijah never hunted again. He lived another decade, quiet and withdrawn, until he passed in 1989. In his cabin, his nephew found a journal. The final entry read, "The whistle followed me home last night. I pray it doesn't find the door." To this day, hikers in Monongahela whisper about the night whistler, a creature that stalks the lonely, whistling in tones too human to be an animal, yet too wrong to be a man. Some say it's a spirit of those who died in the forests. Others believe it's older, something that's always lived in the Appalachian dark. What no one argues with is this: if you hear whistling in the woods after dark, don't answer. Don't call back. Don't even stop to listen. Because if the whistle begins to follow you, it's already too late. And that was the tale of the night whistler of West Virginia, a story rooted deep in Appalachian soil, whispered from hunter to hunter. In the fall of 1996, nearly 44 years after the infamous Flatwoods monster sighting, Braxton County, West Virginia, was once again gripped by fear. The town had long since embraced its eerie reputation, turning it into tourist charm, souvenirs, little alien figurines, and monster fest gatherings. Most people treated the tale as a quirky piece of local folklore. But for two teenagers, Derek Miller and Jason Hart, it became terrifying reality. That September, the boys decided to camp out in the hills not far from the original sighting site. They were 17, restless, and chasing adrenaline. They packed a small tent, flashlights, and an old camcorder Jason borrowed from his uncle. Their goal was simple: spend the night in the woods where the legend was born, record the adventure, and maybe even fake a scare to show their friends. By dusk, they'd set up camp on a ridge overlooking the valley. The air was cool, crickets filled the night with their steady hum, and for the first few hours, nothing felt unusual. It was close to midnight when things shifted. Jason had been fiddling with the camcorder, shining the light around the tree line, when Derek noticed something strange. At first, it looked like fog rolling down from the ridge. But the longer they stared, the more they realized the mist was holding shape, clinging low to the ground like it was alive. The crickets stopped. The silence felt suffocating. Then came the sound, a metallic hiss, like air leaking from a pressurized pipe. The boys froze. From within the mist, a tall figure glided between the trees. Jason swung the flashlight toward it, and both of them sucked in their breath. The beam caught a silhouette, a massive form with broad shoulders, a hood-like head, and arms ending in sharp, claw-like appendages. Its eyes reflected the light with an intense red glow, unwavering and cold. The boys stood paralyzed, every instinct screaming to run, yet their legs wouldn't obey. The thing tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, like it was studying them. Then the hissing grew louder, rattling the air, a sound that made the camcorder crackle with static. Panic snapped them out of their trance. Derek grabbed Jason by the arm, and they bolted down the ridge toward their car. Behind them, heavy rustling followed, branches snapping as if something enormous was moving effortlessly through the woods. Jason screamed that it was chasing them, but Derek didn't dare look back. They tore through the brush, slipping on loose dirt, hearts slamming against their ribs. When they finally reached the car, gasping and bloodied from scratches, Jason fumbled with the keys. Just as the headlights flicked on, Derek saw it, standing at the tree line, not 20 yards away. Its form was clearer now, metallic sheen glinting in the beams, towering at least 10 feet tall. The red eyes locked on them as the hissing filled the night again, louder, closer, vibrating through their bones. Jason slammed the car into gear, and they sped off, tires spitting gravel, neither daring to look back. The next morning, when they gathered the courage to return for their tent, what they found made their stomachs turn. The fabric of the tent was shredded into ribbons. Their cooler was overturned, contents strewn across the clearing. And on the hood of Jason's car, 3 long gouges carved deep into the paint, as though by claws or metal talons. When they tried to show the sheriff, he dismissed it as vandalism. Teenagers, he said, often made up stories. The scratches? Probably from barbed wire or kids messing around. But the boys knew the truth. They stopped talking about it publicly, but in private, they swore they hadn't imagined it. Years later, Jason admitted he burned the camcorder tape. Whatever had been recorded was so distorted with static and shrieks that he couldn't bear to keep it. Derek never returned to those woods, and both men, now older, still refused to camp anywhere near Braxton County. And so, the Flatwoods Monster was written off once again as folklore, a tourist gimmick, a tall tale for festivals. But those who heard Derek and Jason's story couldn't shake the unease. If the monster was only ever seen once in 1952, why did it return 44 years later? And more importantly, what if it never left? The Appalachian Mountains are older than memory, older than the towns and settlers that their valleys, older even than the Cherokee who once walked their ridges and whispered of the spirits that lingered there. They called the land haunted, cursed, alive with forces that punished those who broke sacred laws. Among their darkest stories was one legend told in hushed voices. The Wampus Cat, a creature that was once a woman who had defied her people and was cursed to live forever as something in between, half human, half mountain cat, her soul twisted by rage and sorrow. To see her was to see punishment made flesh, a warning carved into the living wilderness. For most, the Wampus Cat was nothing more than a fireside tale. But in the summer of 1983, a park ranger named Daniel Whitmore came face to face with something in the Smoky Mountains that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Daniel was 32, level-headed, and skeptical of old folklore. He had grown up in Asheville, North Carolina, and had worked the Smokies for years. He loved the forest with a quiet reverence, but he had no patience for ghost stories. He'd laugh when tourists asked about the Wampus Cat, or when older rangers teased about strange cries in the night. But on a hot August evening, he was given a call he couldn't ignore. Hikers had reported eerie screams on the Cherokee Trail, sounds that didn't belong to any animal they knew. Locals said it was probably a bobcat, but the superintendent ordered Daniel to check it out. He left just before dusk, carrying his flashlight, revolver, and radio, expecting nothing more than another uneventful walk through the woods. The first part of the hike was ordinary, though the forest felt unusually heavy that night. The trees pressed close together, the light faded quicker than usual, and the air was so humid it clung to his skin. Cicadas buzzed, filling the silence, but Daniel thought he could hear something else underneath, a low moan, faint and far away. He dismissed it, telling himself it was the wind moving through the hollows. But as he hiked deeper, he began to notice strange tracks in the dirt. At first glance, they looked like mountain lion prints, but too big and spaced unevenly as though the creature had limped or dragged something. Kneeling down, he followed them with his flashlight, and what he saw made his skin crawl. Faint impressions of bare human feet pressed into the soil beside the feline tracks, as if two different beings had walked together, or worse, as if one creature carried both forms at once. The hair on the back of his neck rose. Before he could think too much about it, the woods fell suddenly silent. The cicadas stopped. The birds went quiet. He held his breath, listening. That's when the scream came. It tore through the trees like a knife, so sharp and high-pitched it made his eardrums ache. It sounded like a woman in agony, crying out from deep in the forest, but twisted, wrong, carried on a growl so low it vibrated in his chest. He froze, hand on his revolver, whispering, "Hello? Anyone out there?" But no answer came. Only the echo of the scream rolling through the ridges. The beam of his flashlight swept across the trail, and then he saw it, movement quick and low, darting behind the trees. He spun toward it, trying to keep the light steady, but whatever was moved too fast. The scream came again, closer this time, closer than it should have been. Static burst from his radio as he tried to call for backup, but the signal broke into dead air. His heart hammered. He backed down the trail, every instinct screaming at him to leave. Then, at the edge of the light, the thing stepped into view. At first, Daniel thought it was a mountain lion, but his mind rejected it instantly. It was hunched, long, its body stretched and sinewy, with patches of missing fur that exposed raw skin underneath. But it was the face that nearly stopped his heart. The face was not a cat's at all. It was almost human. Yellow eyes glowed out of the shadows, filled with rage. Black hair hung tangled around its shoulders, matted and wild. And though its mouth twisted into a snarl, the shape of the lips was horrifyingly human. He stood frozen, unable to breathe as it tilted its head at him, like it was studying. And then, impossibly, it rose on its two legs, towering nearly 7 feet tall, arms hanging too long, claws gleaming in the beam. The scream came again, this time from its open mouth, a scream so shrill it felt like his skull would split. His left ear burst in pain, blood trickling from his canal. He fired his revolver, the shot cracking through the forest. The creature shrieked, recoiling, but it didn't fall. It darted sideways, vanishing into the brush, faster than anything he had ever seen. Daniel backed down the trail, firing again, his hands trembling, but every time he caught a glimpse of movement, it was gone. The thing was circling him. He could feel it. Branches snapped, leaves rustled. The glowing eyes appeared here and there, never close enough to shoot, always just beyond the reach of the flashlight. He turned in circles, breathing hard, whispering prayers under his breath. Finally, panic took over. He turned and ran, crashing through the forest, branches whipping his face, boots pounding the dirt. Behind him the screams followed, echoing through the trees, sometimes behind, sometimes ahead, as though it was driving him, pushing him deeper into its territory. He stumbled down a slope and burst into a small clearing, chest heaving. His flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging him into total blackness. The silence that followed was unbearable, crushing. Then he heard it, slow, heavy breathing. Not his own, something else. Right behind him. He spun, revolver raised, but before he could fire, a clawed hand struck out of the dark, knocking the gun away. He fell hard, the breath knocked out of him. Looming above was the wampus cat, eyes burning yellow, breath foul with rot. It leaned so close he could feel the heat of it, smell the stink of decay. And then it did something that shattered him to his core. It whispered. The voice was low, rasping, broken, but unmistakably female. "You shouldn't have come here," Daniel screamed, scrambling backwards in the dirt, his hands desperate. By some miracle, his fingers brushed against the revolver. He grabbed it, firing blind. The shot roared. The creature screamed, retreating into the shadows. Daniel staggered to his feet and ran, stumbling through the trees until the trail opened ahead. He didn't stop until the ranger station lights appeared, glowing faint in the distance like salvation. When he burst inside, covered in dirt and blood, his coworkers thought he had lost his mind. He was pale, trembling, ear bleeding, his clothes shredded. He babbled about what he saw, the screams, the face, the whisper. No one believed him. But when they searched the trail the next morning, they found claw marks gouged deep into trees, marks that looked nothing like a bear or bobcat. And on the dirt, prints, huge feline tracks pressed alongside faint impressions of human feet. Daniel never set foot on the Cherokee Trail again. 2 weeks later, he resigned from the service, citing personal reasons. But those close to him knew the truth. His left ear never healed. He lived with a permanent ringing that drove him half mad. He walked with a limp from the injuries of that night. And when he drank, which he often did in his later years, he would whisper about the eyes, the scream, and the words it had spoken. You shouldn't have come here. The Appalachian night has a way of swallowing sound, of folding the world into silence, so deep you begin to believe you're the last person alive. But in the hills of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, silence is never safe. That's where the legend of the Mothman lives, and where shadows stretch longer than they should, carrying whispers of something watching from just beyond the edge of the light. It was November of 1966 when the first official sightings began, but the truth is that strange things had been happening in those valleys long before newspapers gave a name. Stories of red eyes glinting from treetops, wings that blotted out the stars, and a sense of dread so heavy it clung like a fever. The Mothman wasn't just a creature. It was an omen, a shadow with intent, and one man's encounter with it proved just how close horror can live to prophecy. His name was Richard Carmichael, a 38-year-old truck driver from Ohio. He often hauled coal along the back roads through Point Pleasant, crossing the Ohio River by the Silver Bridge. He was no fool, a man of routine, hard-headed, built like the very mountains he drove through. Richard wasn't the type to get spooked. But on a bitter cold night in December of 1966, Richard found himself on a route that would carve his name into whispered legend. He was tired, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that makes headlights blur and road signs smear together. He pulled off onto a gravel lot near the TNT area, an abandoned munitions site from the war, a place already steeped in rumors of hauntings and strange lights in the sky. He just wanted to close his eyes for a few minutes, let the hum of the engine lull him into something like rest. But what he woke to was not rest. It was terror. At first, it was the sound that stirred him. A low humming, like 1,000 locusts vibrating in the dark. He blinked awake, the cab of his truck fogged with his breath. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was alive. He killed the engine and sat in silence, listening. That's when he saw it in the corner of his windshield. 2 glowing red orbs suspended above the hood, unblinking, burning like coals in the night. His first thought was taillights, maybe another vehicle, but they were too high, too steady. His second thought died in his throat when the orbs blinked. They weren't lights. They were eyes. Richard fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling, but before he could switch it on, a shadow moved. A shape unfolded itself from the tree lean, impossibly tall, blacker than the night around it. Wings, vast and skeletal, stretched wide, brushing against the branches. The creature crouched, its head cocked unnaturally, eyes still fixed on him, glowing with a rage that didn't feel animal. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. He thought about starting the truck, but instinct told him not to. Some primitive part of his brain screamed that if he moved, it would strike. The silence was unbearable. Then, with a sound like fabric tearing through the air, the creature leapt. It didn't run. It didn't climb. It soared, wings beating so violently the gravel shook beneath the tires. Richard ducked, covering his head as a shadow passed directly over the cab. He could hear the rush of wind, the low vibrating hum intensifying until it felt like his skull was rattling. He forced himself upright, eyes darting to the rearview mirror, and nearly screamed. It was there, perched on the back of his trailer, crouched like some grotesque gargoyle, its talons gouging metal, its eyes staring into the mirror as though it could see straight through him. Panic ripped through him. He slammed the ignition, the truck roaring to life, tires spinning as he lurched onto the road. Gravel spat from under the wheels, the cab shuddering as he tore through the dark, praying speed would save him. But the shadow followed. He didn't need to look back to know it was there. The truck vibrated with every beat of its wings. The air filled with that unholy hum. And then came the screech, a piercing shriek like steel screaming against steel, so loud his vision blurred. Mile after mile, he drove blind with terror, knuckles white on the wheel. The bridge loomed ahead, the Silver Bridge, its arches lit faintly by distant lamps. Relief surged through him. If he could make it across, maybe the thing would vanish. Maybe the light would drive it back. But as he reached the halfway point, something changed. The hum stopped. The beating wings silenced. The night fell still again. He slowed, breath ragged, daring to believe it was gone. That's when he looked in the rear view one last time, and his blood turned to ice. The creature was no longer on his truck. It was on the bridge itself, standing in the middle of the steel span, wings folded, eyes burning. It towered over the lanes like a sentinel. The headlights cast its shadow long across the beams, warping, stretching, as though the bridge itself carried its form. Richard slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop, paralyzed by the sight. The Mothman tilted its head, studying him, then spread its wings wide. For a moment, the entire bridge seemed to tremble. And then, with a single leap, it vanished into the night sky, swallowed by darkness. Richard sat frozen, unable to breathe, the truck idling on the bridge. He didn't move until the horizon began to pale with the faintest touch of dawn. When he finally crossed, his hand still shook so badly he could hardly shift gears. He told no one at first. Who would believe him? But when the Silver Bridge collapsed 1 year later, killing 46 people, Richard broke his silence. He swore to anyone who would listen that he had seen the Mothman on that bridge, standing like a shadow of doom, a harbinger of what was to come. People dismissed him. Some called him a liar, others a drunk, a fool clinging to superstition. But there were others who listened, because Richard wasn't the only one who saw glowing red eyes in those years. Dozens of townsfolk reported a similar figure, perched on rooftops, gliding silently over fields, lurking near the river. Some claimed their dogs vanished after barking at something in the dark. Others swore they were chased down lonely backroads by wings that blotted out the moon. And when the bridge fell, when steel twisted and screams echoed over the icy river, too many began to wonder if the creature hadn't just been real, but a warning. Richard lived the rest of his life haunted by that night. He stopped driving long haul, refusing to cross bridges after sundown. His children whispered about how he'd wake screaming in the dark, convinced he heard wings beating against the roof. And on the anniversary of the collapse, he would sit at the riverbank with a bottle in hand, staring into the mist as though waiting for glowing eyes to rise from the fog. He died in 1992, his story ridiculed by some, feared by others, but never forgotten. Even now, Point Pleasant clings to the legend. Tourists come for the statue, for the annual festival, for the thrill of chasing a monster story. But locals know better. Some things in those hills are older than festivals, older than statues. Some things don't fade with time. And when the air grows still along the Ohio River, when the lights of the bridge cast strange shadows, some say you can still feel the hum in your bones. The shadow of wings, the weight of red eyes, watching, waiting. The Appalachian backroads are lonely places, the kind of roads that curl through endless forests and forgotten hollows where cell-serviced eyes and headlights seem to vanish into the dark. Those who've driven them at night know there's a presence that lingers out there, something that watches from the tree-line and runs just beyond the reach of your lights. Some call them black dogs, others whisper about coal mine guardians, but most folks in the mountains know them by one name, the hellhounds. Massive beasts with glowing eyes and breath like smoke, their appearance is never random. They are omens, harbingers, shadows that run beside you when death is close. And for one man, a coal miner named Frank Doyle, the hellhound wasn't just a story. It was a warning carved into the dirt road one winter night in 1979. Frank was 46 years old, a man hardened by years underground. He'd worked the coal seams outside Logan, West Virginia, since he was 16, breathing dust and living with the kind of weariness only miners know. He didn't fear much, not cave-ins, not the constant risk of explosion, not even the dark that pressed like stone against his skin every day. But he did fear the silence of the mountains at night, a silence that seemed to swallow headlights whole and whisper back your own breath. It was December, bitter cold, the kind of night when frost coated every branch and the wind carried strange whistles through the hollows. Frank was driving home from the late shift, his pickup rattling along the gravel back road toward his house, tucked deep in the hills. He kept the radio off, windows cracked just enough to let the bite of winter keep him awake. For the first few miles, The only sound were his tires crunching ice and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, as he rounded a bend, he saw them, 2 points of light on the road ahead. At first, he thought they were reflectors from a mailbox or the glint of another car. But as he got closer, he realized they were too high, too steady, and glowing with a red hue that burned like hot coals. His stomach tightened. He slowed, squinting through the windshield. That's when it stepped into the road. The creature was massive, far larger than any dog he'd seen. Its black fur so dark it seemed to absorb the headlights. Its body was lean but muscular, every rib pronounced under the slick coat, its legs impossibly long, ending in paws that looked more like claws. But what froze Frank's blood were the eyes, burning red, unblinking, staring straight into him with a hatred that didn't feel animal. Its mouth opened in a low growl, and he swore he saw steam curl from its jaws, though no breath should have been visible in that cold. For a long moment, man and beast stared at one another on that lonely Appalachian road, the world holding its breath. Frank's instinct screamed at him to gun the engine, to plow past it, but his body refused. He was trapped, paralyzed by the weight of its gaze. Then, without a sound, the hellhound moved. It didn't lunge or run. It simply vanished into the tree-line, swallowed by the dark. Relief surged through him, shaky and hollow. He forced the truck forward, telling himself it was just a stray, some trick of the eyes. But the relief lasted only seconds. From the corner of his mirror, he saw it, running alongside him, its legs stretched unnaturally long, keeping pace with the truck as though speed meant nothing. He pressed the gas, the engine whining as the truck bounced over ruts. But no matter how fast he went, the creature stayed beside him, glowing eyes fixed on him, jaws hanging open in a silent snarl. His heart thundered. He shouted into the empty cab, a desperate curse, as if words could drive it away. But the thing didn't falter. It only drew closer until its shadow pressed against the glass. Frank swerved, trying to shake it, the truck nearly tipping into the ditch. For a moment, the beast fell back, swallowed again by the night. But just when he thought was gone, a sound split the silence, a howl so deep it rattled his chest. It wasn't the howl of a dog. It was something older, primal, a cry that felt like it had been echoing in those hills since before men walked them. It rose and fell, shaking the trees, filling the cab until Frank's ears rang. He fumbled for his cross necklace, muttering prayers under his breath, his hands trembling on the wheel. But prayers didn't matter. The hellhound appeared again, this time in the middle of the road, standing tall, its body stretching impossibly long, its eyes burning brighter than before. He slammed the brakes, the tires skidding, the truck sliding sideways until it stopped just inches from the beast. For a moment, time froze. The hellhound stood, its chest heaving, its breath fogging the air. And then it stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Its claws scraped against the frozen gravel, sparks flickering in the night. Frank raised his revolver, kept in the glove box, hands shaking so badly the barrel clinked against the steering wheel. He fired. The shot cracked like thunder, echoing through the valley. The beast didn't flinch. The bullet passed through as though it were smoke. Its eyes only burned brighter. Frank fired again and again until the revolver clicked empty. Nothing. The hellhound kept walking, its growl rising until the truck vibrated under the sound. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it stopped. It lowered its head, meeting his eyes one last time. And in that stare, Frank felt something worse than fear. He felt certainty. The thing wasn't here to kill him. Not tonight. It was here to warn him. He didn't understand it then. Not fully. But something in his gut told him the truth. Death was near. Maybe not for him, maybe not that night, but it was coming. With a final, bone-shaking howl, the hellhound turned and bounded into the woods, vanishing between the trees as if the forest had swallowed a whole. Frank drove home in silence, his body numb, his mind reeling. He stumbled into bed, his wife asking what was wrong, but he had no words. He only muttered, "Saw it, saw the dog," before falling into a restless sleep. 2 days later, the mine where Frank worked collapsed without warning. 30 men were trapped. 17 died before rescue crews could reach them. Frank survived. He'd taken that night off, claiming he was too sick to work. His co-workers called it luck. But Frank knew better. The hellhound had marked the coming death, had run beside him on that frozen road to make sure he understood. And though he'd escaped, he carried the weight of that warning for the rest of his life. Years later, Frank told the story only once, in a bar after too much whiskey, his hands trembling as he whispered about red eyes and smoke breath. Some laughed, called him crazy. But others, old men with the same coal, dust etched into their skin, nodded in silence. They'd heard the howls too. They knew the curse of the hellhound. And every now and then, a new story surfaces. A trucker seeing glowing eyes in his mirrors on Route 52. A widow swearing a black beast followed her car the night before her husband died. A hiker finding paw prints the size of dinner plates burned into frozen ground. Always the same description. Always the same omen. And so the hellhound remains part of the Appalachian night. If you ever find yourself driving a back road where the trees press too close and the silence weighs too heavy, watch the edges of your headlights. If you see two burning red eyes keeping pace beside you, don't think speeding up will save you. Don't think bullets will stop it. The Appalachian night can play tricks on your mind, but sometimes what you see in the shadows isn't a trick at all. Sometimes it's something that shouldn't exist. In the little town of Flatwoods, West Virginia, people still whisper about one night in 1952 when something came down from the sky and left behind a terror that lingers even now. Locals call it the Flatwoods Monster, though no one can truly say what it was. Alien, demon, apparition, it doesn't matter. What matters is that when people saw it, their lives were never the same again. The encounter began on September 12th, a humid evening when the sky burned red with sunset and the first stars shimmered above the hills. It was an ordinary Saturday until a streak of light ripped across the sky, trailing smoke and flame. People poured out of their homes, pointing and shouting, certain they had seen a meteor. But the fireball didn't vanish in the distance. It landed, or crashed, in the hills just outside town, and that's when the horror began. A group of local boys, curious and bold, decided to find out what it was. Edward and Fred May, along with their friend Tommy Heyer, raced up the dirt road toward the hilltop, their voices carrying through the evening air. They stopped at the home of Kathleen May, Edward and Fred's mother, breathless and begging her to come. Kathleen, no stranger to the boys' wild imaginations, hesitated at first, but the look in their eyes convinced her. She called out to two other neighbors, Neil Nunley and Ronnie Shaver, and the small group set off together, climbing the hillside with nothing but flashlights and adrenaline. The path twisted through the woods, the air thick with the smell of smoke and something else, something acrid, metallic, that burned the back of the throat. Kathleen would later say it smelled like burning sulfur. The closer they got, the stranger the world became. The crickets fell silent, the dogs in town howled, and the night seemed to press against them. Then, as they crested the ridge, their lights caught something that made them freeze. At first, it looked like a pair of glowing eyes, set high off the ground, far higher than any person's. They reflected the flashlights with a deep, burning red, and beneath them, a dark shape began to emerge. What stepped into view defied reason. The figure stood nearly 10 feet tall, its body cloaked in what looked like a metallic suit, shaped like a spade with the head encased in a hood that tapered to a point. The eyes glowed unnaturally bright, piercing and unblinking, set in a face that seemed both mechanical and alive. Its body was long and tapering, with clawed, spindly arms that stretched downward like insect limbs, scraping the ground. The smell of sulfur thickened, burning their lungs. Kathleen gasped, clutching her sons to her flashlight trembling in her hand. The monster hissed, a sound like steam escaping a boiler, and then it began to move toward them. Panic erupted. The boys screamed. Kathleen shouted for everyone to run. The group stumbled back down the hillside, tripping over roots, their flashlights swinging wildly. Behind them, the hissing grew louder, followed by a shriek that seemed to split the night in half. Neil swore later that he saw the creature glide, not walk, moving without touching the ground, its form hovering like some nightmarish phantom. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of their homes, gasping and trembling, the sulfur stench clinging to their clothes and hair. Kathleen, shaking but determined, called the sheriff. Within the hour, law enforcement arrived, along with other curious townsfolk drawn by the commotion. Together they returned to the hillside, flashlights and lanterns cutting through the dark. But the creature was gone. What they found instead were signs that something unnatural had been there. The grass was scorched in a strange, circular pattern. Trees oozed a sticky, oily residue that burned the skin on contact. The air reeked of metal and chemicals, heavy enough to make the searchers gag. Deputies took notes, but their hands trembled. Some said they heard faint mechanical clicks in the woods, like gears turning in the dark. But the monster itself never reappeared. By dawn, the hill was quiet again, the air cleared, and all that remained was confusion and fear. The next day, word spread quickly. The Charleston Gazette ran a headline, "Braxton County Monster Seen by Flatwoods Group." Reporters descended on the small town, shoving cameras into the faces of Kathleen and the boys. Skeptics laughed it off as hysteria, claiming the group had seen nothing more than a barn owl perched in a tree, its eyes reflecting light, its wings casting shadows in the smoky air. But those who stood on that hill knew better. The size, the smell, the sound. No owl in this world could explain what they saw. For weeks afterward, strange things continued to happen in Flatwoods. Dogs refused to go near the hill, growling and cowering with tails tucked tight. Locals reported lights in the sky, glowing orbs that hovered silently before vanishing into the night. Some said they saw figures moving in the woods, tall and spindly, too large to be human. And the witnesses themselves suffered. Kathleen reported that her eyes and throat burned for days after the encounter, as though she had been exposed to chemicals. The boys suffered nausea, vomiting, and headaches that lingered for weeks. Doctors dismissed it as nerves. But those who were there knew it was the creature, leaving its mark. The story might have faded into folklore, another ghost tale whispered in the mountains, if not for the persistence of locals who swore the government came sniffing around afterward. Men in black suits were said to have questioned Kathleen, urging her to stop telling the story. Strangers were spotted at the hill, carrying equipment, taking samples, speaking in hushed tones before disappearing again. To some, it was proof the Flatwoods monster wasn't a monster at all, but something from the sky, something the government wanted hidden. To others, it was darker, a demon born of the Appalachian night, drawn by the streak of fire as a sign, a herald of something beyond human comprehension. But no matter the theory, one thing remains certain. Those who encountered it never forgot. The memory of the glowing red eyes, the towering spade-shaped hood, the stench of sulfur and metal, lived on in their bones. Kathleen May went to her grave insisting it was real, that she had seen something not of this earth. The boys grew into men, but when they spoke of that night, their voices still shook, as if the memory hadn't dulled with time. And in Flatwoods, the legend endured. A statue now stands in the town, cartoonish and strange, a tourist attraction for those seeking a thrill. But ask the older residents, the ones who remember the night of September 12th, and their smiles will fade. Their eyes will shift to the hills, as if something still lingers there. Even today, hikers who wander too close to the old crash site sometimes report the same smell, sulfur, acrid and burning, carried on the wind without warning. Hunters claim they've seen lights hovering in the trees, lights that vanish the second a flashlight touches them. A few whisper about shadows that move too quickly, too tall, gliding just at the edge of sight. And every once in a while, someone swears they hear it. The hiss, the shriek, the sound that froze a group of Flatwoods residents in 1952. A sound not of this world. There are places in the Appalachian Mountains where the land itself seems to bleed, where the rivers run dark and the hills echo with voices of men long dead. And one such place lies near a narrow stretch of land the locals call Bloody Creek, a name whispered with unease even by those who've lived in its shadow all their lives. For that is where, more than a century ago, a mining accident took dozens of lives, sealing them forever beneath the earth. And though the mine was abandoned and the entrances collapsed, the dead never truly left, their pain and fury seeping into the soil, into the water, into the air itself, until it became impossible to walk the old trails without feeling that you were being watched. And people who dared to linger near the creek after dark began to speak of seeing a figure among the trees. A miner, or what was left of him, his lamp glowing faintly in the mist, his face hidden beneath a soot-blackened helmet, and his body broken and twisted, moving in a slow, jerking manner as though his bones were shattered and yet still forced to walk. The story begins in the late 1800s, when coal was king and men clawed at the mountainsides for the black rock that powered America. And in those days, Bloody Creek was a thriving camp, filled with rough cabins, muddy streets, and the ceaseless clang of pickaxes. Among the miners was a man named Silas Crowley, a wiry fellow with tired eyes and calloused hands, who had left behind a wife and 2 daughters in Virginia to earn a living in the hills of West Virginia. Silas was known for being dependable, the kind of man who would take an extra shift without complaint, but he also carried with him a superstition, muttering prayers before he entered the shafts, leaving small offerings at the entrance, coins, bits of tobacco, sometimes even drops of his own blood. The others teased him for it, but Silas would only shake his head and say the mountain was alive, and if you didn't pay your due, it would take what it wanted. No one laughed when the collapse happened. It was a spring morning in 1892 when the earth groaned like a wounded beast and the mountain swallowed 50 men alive. Silas was among them, trapped deep underground when the ceiling caved in. For 3 days, rescue crews clawed through the rubble, listening to the faint tapping of hammers and the muffled cries of men entombed, but the deeper they dug, the more unstable the shaft became, until finally the company ordered it sealed, pronouncing all inside as lost. Widows wailed in the streets of the camp, children clutched scraps of their fathers' clothing, and the miners who survived drank themselves senseless, their eyes haunted by the memory of voices they could not save. But not all the dead went quietly. Not long after the mine was sealed, strange things began to happen. At night, men returning from late shifts swore they saw a lantern light bobbing in the trees near the creek, too far from any trail. Sometimes they heard coughing, deep and wet, echoing through the forest. And then came the first sighting of the miner himself. It was a boy, no older than 12, who saw him. He had been out searching for firewood when he spotted a figure across the creek, standing utterly still. The man's body was twisted, his legs bent in unnatural angles, and his chest rose and fell with a wheezing, gurgling sound, as if each breath was a struggle. In his hand, he held a dented lantern that glowed with a pale, bluish light. The boy dropped his bundle of sticks and ran, but when he told his mother, she slapped him silent, warning him never to speak of it again. But the story spread anyway, carried from mouth to mouth, until even the bravest miners refused to walk near Bloody Creek alone. Decades passed, the camp dissolved, the cabins rotted away, but the ghost remained. Fishermen whispered of feeling unseen hands tugging at their lines. Hunters spoke of hearing footsteps behind them in the brush, and hikers said the air grew so heavy near the creek that it felt like drowning. Those who saw the ghostly miner up close said his face was the worst of all. Beneath the cracked helmet and soot-stained skin, his eyes glowed faintly, not with fire, but with a dim, sorrowful light, and his mouth hung open in a permanent scream, jaw unhinged, teeth broken and bloodied, as though he had died mid-cry, begging for air that would never come. In the 1960s, 2 teenagers on a dare camped by the creek, laughing at the old stories. They brought beer, a transistor radio, and sleeping bags, certain they would prove the legend false. But sometime after midnight, they were awakened by the sound of metal striking stone. Tap, tap, tap. They thought it was someone playing a prank, until the sound grew louder, joined by the faint creak of old timber and the hiss of shifting rock. Then they smelled it, the stench of damp earth and rot, the kind of smell you find in a collapsed cellar or a graveyard after a storm. One boy shined his flashlight toward the trees, And there it was, the miner, standing just at the edge of the light, his twisted body swaying, his lantern glowing pale blue. The boys screamed and bolted, abandoning everything. Their gear was found the next morning, scattered and damp, but the boys never returned to retrieve it. They refused to speak of what they had seen, except to admit, in broken whispers, that the ghost was real. Over the years, the miner became a local legend, a campfire tale to scare children, but there were always those who insisted it wasn't just a story. Hunters vanished near the creek, their rifles discovered rusted and broken in the mud. Once, a group of construction workers tasked with clearing part of the hillside reported hearing voices underground. Faint, pleading voices, as though men still trapped beneath the rock were begging to be freed. One worker quit on the spot, swearing he saw a hand, pale and skeletal, clawing out of the soil before vanishing again. Even today, Bloody Creek is avoided by locals. Hikers who take the wrong trail report disembodied lantern light leading them deeper into the woods, always toward the old mine, and some never return. Those who do often speak of dreams afterward, dreams of suffocating in the dark, of dirt filling their mouths and lungs while a broken man with glowing eyes watches, unmoving from the shadows. What makes the tale of the ghostly miner most terrifying is the belief that he doesn't just wander aimlessly. He searches. Some say he's looking for his family, others that he wants to drag the living down into the earth to join the men who died with him. There are even whispers that if you hear the tapping of his pickaxe 3 times, it means he has chosen you. People who have heard the tapping don't live long, at least not in peace. They sicken, they waste away, or they die suddenly in accidents, their bodies crushed, twisted, or suffocated, as though the miner reached out from the grave to claim them. There are places in the Appalachians where the woods seem too quiet, where even the owls refuse to cry out and the deer vanish as if the forest itself has emptied. And one such place is Boone Hollow, a forgotten stretch of winding trails and rotting cabins tucked deep into the mountains of Kentucky, where locals whisper of a creature that prowls beneath the moonlight, a beast neither man nor animal, something born of hunger and curses and blood. And though the word werewolf might sound like superstition carried from Europe, the people of Boone Hollow speak of it in low voices, not as legend, but as truth, for too many have vanished in those woods, their bodies torn apart, their screams echoing in the valleys long after the night has swallowed them whole. The story begins with a family, Jacob Turner, his wife Eliza, and their 2 sons, who settled in Boone Hollow in the 1920s, drawn by cheap land and the promise of living off the forest. They built a small cabin at the edge of the hollow, and for the first few years, life was hard but peaceful. They farmed a little corn, raised a few hogs, and hunted game in the woods. But then the animals began to disappear. First, it was the chickens slaughtered in the night, their bodies left mangled near the coop, not eaten, just destroyed. Then the hogs were attacked, their pens splintered, the animals torn apart as though by some massive predator. Jacob thought it was a bear, and he took his rifle into the woods, determined to kill whatever had been prowling near his farm. He never came back the same. When Jacob returned from the hunt, his eyes were wild, his clothes shredded, and blood soaked his hands. Eliza begged him to tell her what happened, but all he said was, "It weren't no bear," before collapsing onto the bed, shivering with fever. That night, he tossed and turned, his body burning up, sweat soaking the sheets. By morning, his fever had broken, but Jacob was different. His temper flared at the smallest thing. His appetite grew insatiable, and at night he began wandering the woods, muttering under his breath, his eyes catching the lantern light with an unnatural glow. Eliza tried to keep the family together, but the boys were terrified, whispering that their father's teeth seemed sharper, his nails longer, his voice not his own. Then came the night of the first full moon. Eliza awoke to the sound of screams outside the cabin, guttural and inhuman, mingled with the frantic squeals of their last surviving hog. She grabbed a lantern and stumbled to the door, only to freeze at what she saw. Standing in the yard was not her husband, but a creature that still wore his face. Jacob's body had twisted into something monstrous, his back arched, muscles bulging, hair sprouting across his arms and chest. His mouth stretched into a muzzle lined with fangs, his eyes glowed yellow, and blood dripped from his claws as he hunched over the half-devoured body of the hog. He lifted his head at the sound of her gasp, and in that moment Eliza knew that the man she had married was gone. The thing that was once Jacob lunged toward her, and she slammed the door just in time, barring it with a heavy beam across the frame. The beast clawed at the wood, snarling and howling, shaking the cabin with its fury. The boys screamed, clinging to their mother as the creature circled, its growls rattling the walls. Then, as suddenly as it began, the attack stopped. The beast vanished into the woods, leaving behind silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the terrified family. By dawn, Jacob returned, naked and filthy, his body covered in scratches and blood. He collapsed onto the porch, whispering, "Don't let me in," before losing consciousness. Eliza dragged him inside anyway, weeping, torn between love and fear. But deep down she knew the truth. Her husband had become something cursed, something unnatural, and Boone Hollow would never be safe again. For the next few months, Jacob tried to fight it. He chained himself to the bed on nights of the full moon, begged his wife to keep the rifle loaded, swore that if he lost control, she should put a bullet through his skull. But when the hunger came, the chains broke as though they were twine, and the rifle always felt too heavy in Eliza's trembling hands. Soon the killing spread beyond their farm. A hunter was found near the creek, his body ripped open, his bones gnawed. A young woman vanished on her way home from church, her bonnet discovered shredded and blood-stained along the trail. Neighbors whispered about a beast in the hollow, something too cunning to be a bear, too vicious to be a man. Some swore they saw glowing eyes in the trees at night, watching them from the darkness. Others spoke of howls that shook the mountains, long and mournful cries that carried for miles. Rumors spread fast, and the name Boone Hollow became synonymous with fear. Families moved away, cabins were abandoned, and soon the hollow itself was left to the beast. But not everyone stayed away. In the 1950s, a group of teenagers, drawn by the legend, decided to camp in Boone Hollow on Halloween night. They thought it was a joke, a chance to scare each other with ghost stories. But sometime after midnight, the howls began. At first, the boys laughed, calling them coyotes, but then the sound grew closer, deeper, until the trees themselves seemed to tremble. One of the girls screamed when she saw two glowing eyes in the dark, hovering just beyond the firelight. The boys grabbed flashlights, shining them into the woods, and for a moment they saw it. The beast crouched low, its yellow eyes reflecting the light, its body covered in coarse, black hair, its muzzle dripping with saliva. It growled, and the sound was like thunder in their bones. Panic erupted. The teenagers scattered, sprinting through the trees, their screams echoing in the night. Only 3 of them made it back to town. The others were never found, though days later, hunters discovered scraps of clothing torn and bloodstained near the creek bed. No one doubted the legend after that. Over the decades, Boone Hollow became a place people avoided. Hunters who strayed too far into the woods vanished. Their rifles later discovered snapped in half, their tracks ending in pools of blood. Hikers who took the wrong trail swore they heard heavy footsteps behind them, the sound of breathing so close it raised the hair on the back of their necks, though when they turned, nothing was there. Farmers reported livestock slaughtered in the night, their barns torn apart by something within human strength. And always, there were the howls, long, drawn-out cries that made dogs whimper and children hide beneath their blankets. Some say the beast was Jacob, cursed by something in those woods, perhaps an old spirit of the land angered by the miners and loggers who stripped the hills bare. Others claim it was not a curse, but a sickness, something ancient that infected him with a hunger that no man could resist. And there are those who whisper that Boone Hollow itself is cursed, that the land breeds monsters, feeding them on blood and fear. Whatever the truth, the werewolf of Boone Hollow has become one of the darkest legends of the Appalachians. Even today, there are those who claim the beast still roams the hollow. Truckers passing along the back roads at night report seeing a hulking figure cross the road in a single bound, its eyes catching their headlights before it vanishes into the trees. Raven's Gap is one of those places in the Appalachians where the road winds too sharply, with the trees crowd so close that even at noon the sunlight barely touches the ground, and locals will tell you with pale faces that it's not the terrain that makes people avoid it, but what lives in the holler, for the story goes that a witch once made her home there, a woman who bartered with shadows and called down curses with a single whisper, and though she has been dead for more than 100 years, her presence lingers like a rot in the soil, a poison in the water, and a shadow in the trees. Her name was Margaret Hensley, though most knew her only as Old Mag, a recluse who lived in a crooked cabin at the very heart of Raven's Gap sometime in the mid-1800s. The townsfolk in nearby Clay County feared her from the beginning. She was tall, gaunt, with skin pale as chalk and hair black as coal, and her eyes, people swore, were mismatched, one gray, one green, that glowed faintly in firelight. She kept to herself, but the animals in the forest seemed to follow her, stray dogs and crows lingering near her home, wolves slinking at the edges of her clearing as though waiting for her command. Farmers who crossed her by refusing food or trade sometimes found their livestock dead the next morning, their crops rotting overnight, or their children waking in the night screaming of nightmares they could not explain. No one dared accuse her outright, but they whispered in church pews and prayed that she would leave. Instead, she only grew stronger and her legend darker. The story that cemented her as a true, which came during a particularly harsh winter. A young woman named Annabelle, desperate to save her ailing mother, was said to have visited Old Mag's cabin, begging for medicine. Neighbors swore Anna never returned, and weeks later, her body was found in the woods, drained of blood, her eyes wide open in terror, her mouth frozen in a scream. People whispered that Mag had taken her soul, traded it for her mother's life, for the woman miraculously recovered, though she never spoke again. Fear turned to rage, and the townsfolk gathered torches and rifles, marching into Raven's Gap to burn the witch's cabin to the ground. But when they arrived, the cabin was empty, the fire already roaring as though it had been waiting for them. And just as the walls collapsed, a shadowy figure emerged from the flames. Old Mag herself, her eyes glowing, her mouth curled in a smile that promised vengeance. She vanished into the trees that night, and none dared follow, but the curses began soon after. Families who had joined the mob fell to ruin one by one. Accidents, fires, sickness that came with no cure. Some claimed to see her standing at the edge of their fields at night, her mismatched eyes shining in the dark. Others heard her laughter on the wind, low and cruel, when loved ones gasped their last breath. Within a year, the entire town had dwindled, half its families gone, their cabins abandoned, their names remembered only in whispered prayers. Decades passed, but the legend of the witch never died. Hunters swore that when they wandered into Raven's Gap, the forest grew wrong. Trees bent inward as if to block their way, the air turned colder than it should be, and voices whispered in the underbrush, calling them by name. Some said they found charms hanging from the branches, bundles of bone and hair, dolls stitched from animal hide, jars filled with blood buried beneath the soil. A few claimed they saw her outright, a tall, thin woman drifting between the trees, her pale face visible even in the darkest night, her eyes glowing with unnatural light. None who saw her ever stayed in the gap after sunset. They said she would follow, her footsteps soft but steady, her breath cold against their necks even when they were running. By the 1940s, Raven's Gap had become a place of warning, a cursed hollow where parents told their children never to wander. But the stories didn't stop. In 1947, two brothers went missing while rabbit hunting near the gap. Their dogs returned the next day, shaking and whimpering, their fur singed as if they'd been near fire. The boys were never found, but days later, a farmer swore he saw them walking near the edge of his field at dusk. When he called their names, they turned, and he saw that their faces were gray, their eyes glowing faintly, their mouths sewn shut with black thread. The farmer packed his things that night and left the county forever. Then, In the 1970s, a group of college students, drawn by the legend, decided to camp in Raven's Gap for Halloween. They brought cameras, beer, and bravado, mocking the old stories, laughing in the face of fear. But the laughter didn't last long. That night, as they sat around the fire, the woods grew silent. No crickets, no owls, only the sound of the fire popping. Then came the smell, something acrid and foul, like burning hair. One of the girls gagged, insisting they should leave, but the others teased her until the wind picked up and the fire died out, leaving them in darkness. That's when they saw her. Just beyond the circle of their lantern light, a woman stood, impossibly tall and thin, her hair long and black, her face pale and expressionless. Her mismatched eyes glowed faintly in the dark. At first, they thought it was someone playing a prank, but when she lifted her hand, the girl nearest the lantern screamed and collapsed, clawing at her throat as though invisible fingers were choking her. Panic erupted. They ran through the woods, stumbling in the dark, screaming for each other, but the witch was everywhere. One boy swore she appeared in front of him no matter which way he turned, her face inches from his, her breath ice cold, her eyes drilling into his soul. By dawn, only two of the group staggered out of the gap, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They refused to speak of what they had seen, but they never returned to the mountains again. The others were never found. Even now, Raven's Gap remains a place people avoid. Drivers who take the road at night say their headlights flicker as they pass through, and sometimes they see a woman standing in the middle of the lane, forcing them to swerve into the ditch. When they crawl out of their cars, dazed and bleeding, the woman is gone. Hikers who dare to enter claim they find charms tied to the trees, charms that weren't there the day before. And more than a few hunters have come out of the gap with burns on their skin, as though they'd walked too close to a fire. The most chilling tales are from those who hear her voice. They say it's soft, almost kind, calling their names in the dark, promising warmth, safety, even love. But those who follow the voice are never seen again. Locals believe she collects souls, binding them to her, forcing them to wander the gap forever. And if you listen closely at night, some swear you can hear them, whispering in the trees, their voices hollow, begging for release. Some argue old Mag was no witch at all, but a woman wronged, a healer accused of evil by frightened townsfolk, cursed into becoming the very monster they believed her to be. Others insist she was always wicked, a servant of something darker that dwells in the mountains, a thing older than time itself that lent her power in exchange for blood. Whatever the truth, the result is the same. Raven's Gap is hers, and it always will be. The devil dog of the Appalachians is not the kind of tale you tell lightly, for even whispering its name is said to draw its attention, and those who have seen it rarely live long enough to speak of the horror that follows. Deep in the shadowy valleys of Kentucky and West Virginia, where the ridgelines fold like a never-ending sea of dark green waves, hunters, travelers, and coal miners have passed down the story of a beast that roams the night, a hound of unnatural size with eyes that burn like coals and a growl that rattles the very bones inside your chest. Some say it is a demon bound to the mountains, others that it is the spirit of a dog sacrificed in a ritual gone wrong, and still others whisper that it is a guardian cursed to hunt down those who wander too far into the hidden parts of the woods. But whatever it is, everyone agrees on one thing. You do not want to see it standing in the middle of the trail, its black fur bristling, its teeth gleaming wet under the moonlight. The legend first spread in the late 1800s during the coal rush, when miners told of strange howls echoing through the shafts at night. At first, they blamed wolves or wild dogs, but those who dared investigate found only paw prints far too large for any natural animal, prints that burned into the earth as though the ground itself had been scorched. One miner, a man named Thomas Avery, was among the first to encounter it. He stumbled out of the mine one night after a long shift, his lantern weak, his body aching. The path home took him along a narrow trail through the trees, and that's when he heard it, the low growl, so deep it made his teeth chatter. When he turned, he saw a massive black shape on the path, its eyes glowing like molten iron, its breath steaming in the night air though it wasn't cold. It padded toward him, each step silent but heavy, its claws sinking into the dirt. Terrified, Thomas dropped his lantern and ran. But the beast followed, keeping pace with him effortlessly, its growl growing louder until it was all he could hear. He burst through his front door, slamming it shut, only to find scorch marks across the wood the next morning, claw marks that smoked as if the fire of hell itself had touched them. Thomas never went back to the mines again, and 2 weeks later, his body was found deep in the woods, torn apart, his eyes missing. From then on, miners spoke of the devil dog in hushed tones, and men who vanished underground were often blamed as its victims. The creature was not confined to the mines either. It was said to stalk lonely roads, especially those that wound through Raven Rock and Paint Creek. Travelers in horse-drawn wagons would suddenly find their horses panicking, eyes rolling white, refusing to move forward. Those who forced them onward claimed to see a monstrous black hound standing in the road, too large to be natural, its shadow stretching farther than it should, its growl shaking the ground. A preacher once tried to bless the beast with holy words, raising his Bible in defiance. Witnesses swore the dog only laughed, a sound that froze their blood, before vanishing into the night, leaving behind the smell of sulfur and smoke. The preacher's house burned to the ground that same night, and his family perished inside. By the early 1900s, the devil dog had become a warning, a curse used to frighten children into staying close to home. But the sightings never stopped. Hunters described being followed in the woods, their rifles useless, as the sound of padded footsteps kept pace with them no matter how fast they moved. One man, Elijah Green, swore he shot the beast point blank with a shotgun after it charged him near the Red River Gorge. The shot knocked it back, but instead of bleeding, the dog burst into flames, its body glowing before collapsing into smoke. Elijah thought it was gone, but when he returned home, he found his cabin door torn from its hinges, his livestock slaughtered, and his wife missing. On the wall above his hearth, clawed into the wood, were the words, "You can't kill what's already dead." Elijah disappeared not long after, and some say his screams can still be heard echoing through the gorge on stormy nights. The strangest accounts came from truckers in the 1950s and 60s, when long-haul drivers began reporting terrifying encounters along the Appalachian highways. More than one trucker claimed to see a huge black dog standing in the middle of the road, its eyes burning red. Those who swerved avoided hitting it, only to crash moments later, their rigs overturned, their bodies burned in the wreck. But those who didn't swerve, those who plowed through the beast, told of feeling the truck shudder, the sound of bones snapping under the tires, only to look in the rearview mirror and see the dog standing whole, unharmed, now running alongside the truck at impossible speed. One driver, pale and shaking, told his wife he saw its teeth grinning at him through the glass of his cab window, though the truck was going 60 miles an hour at the time. His rig was found days later at the bottom of a ravine, his body missing, the cab door clawed to shreds. Locals say the devil dog doesn't just appear randomly. It chooses its prey. It follows those who have done something wrong. Liars, thieves, murderers. But just as often, it seems to hunt innocent people who were simply unlucky enough to cross its path. Some believe the beast is bound to the sins of the mountains, feeding on the blood spilled during feuds, accidents, and murders that stain the Appalachian earth. Others claim it is an omen of death. If you see the devil dog once, it means someone close to you will die soon. If you see it twice, it means you yourself are marked. And if you see it 3 times, there is no escape. You belong to it. Modern-day hikers and campers in the Appalachian Trail still report its presence. They describe nights where the forest grows silent. No insects, no owls, no wind. Then comes the sound of breathing, hot, heavy, wet, just beyond the firelight. Eyes glint red in the shadows, circling the camp. But no matter how much light they shine, the beast never fully reveals itself. One camper swore that when he finally looked away from the glowing eyes, he found them much closer, right at the edge of his tent. Another said he woke in the night to the smell of sulfur and saw claw marks burned into the trees around his campsite, smoking as if freshly scorched. And sometimes people vanish without a trace, their tents shredded, their packs left behind, their tracks leading into the woods only to stop suddenly, as though swallowed by the earth. The devil dog is not a story with an ending. It is a story that lingers as alive as the mountains themselves. Old-timers still warn that if you're driving through the Appalachians late at night and your headlights catch a shape on the road, you must not stop, you must not look too long, and above all, you must never meet its eyes. Because if you do, those burning coals will follow you home, into your house, into your dreams, until the night comes when you wake to the sound of claws on your floorboards and hot breath on your neck. They say the beast is patient. It doesn't rush. Once it has marked you, it will circle your life, waiting, watching until your time comes due. And when it does, you won't die quick. You'll hear that growl, so deep and endless it feels like the ground itself is opening beneath you. And then you'll see the teeth dripping fire before darkness takes you.